It came out of reporting that I was doing in Iraq after the invasion, the first year of occupation. But I guess it dates back earlier than that. I happened to have been in Argentina making a documentary film when the war in Iraq began. And it was a really amazing time to be in Latin America. This was 2002, 2003. And this was, I guess, the beginning of what we now think of as this pink tide that has swept Latin America. But it was a moment in Latin American history, certainly a moment in Argentinian history, where the economic model that Latin Americans call neoliberalism, Americans call the free market. But these policies of privatization, so-called free trade, deregulation in the interests of corporations, deep cuts to social spending, healthcare and education cuts, things like that. In Argentina, they actually just call this el modelo, the model. Everybody knows what the model is. It's the so-called Washington Consensus. It's the policies that have been imposed on Latin America, first through military dictatorships, then as conditions attached to loans that were needed during the economic crises, the so-called debt crisis of the 1980s. When I was in Argentina, the model was collapsing, and Argentinians overthrew 5 presidents in 3 weeks. So it was this moment of incredible tumult and political excitement because people were trying to figure out what would come next. But it went beyond Argentina. In Bolivia, they hadn't yet elected Evo Morales, but there had been these huge protests against water privatization, and Bechtel had just been thrown out of Bolivia. And in Brazil, they had just elected Lula. And of course, Chavez was already in power in Venezuela, but he had successfully overcome a coup attempt. He had been brought back to power. So there were all of these things going on in Latin America that were all connected in this rejection of this economic model. So to be in Latin America when the invasion of Iraq began was a really unique vantage point from which to watch the war. I'm very grateful to have had that experience, to have been able to watch that through the eyes of my Latin American friends who saw the war so differently from the way it was seen, I think, by so many of us in North America. They saw a real connection between their rejection of these economic policies and the fact that the same economic program was being imposed in Iraq through tremendous violence. And you really saw and felt those connections in Latin America. You know, Bechtel, just thrown out of Bolivia, suddenly shows up in Baghdad with the exclusive contract to rebuild their water system. And what it felt like was that there was a change going on, that this model that had been imposed coercively, though peacefully, through the International Monetary Fund, through the World Bank, through the World Trade Organization, that wasn't working anymore. People were rejecting it, that the legacy of these policies, the legacy of inequality was so dramatic that the sales pitch of just wait for the trickle down wasn't working anymore. And so now there was this new phase, and it wasn't even asking, and it wasn't negotiating, it was just imposing through raw violence. And that's where I came up with the thesis for the book, which is that we have entered this new phase that I'm calling disaster capitalism, or the shock doctrine, using a shock, in this case the shock and awe invasion of Iraq, to impose what economists call economic shock therapy. So I think it was definitely that experience of seeing it from Latin America, a continent in revolt against these policies, that made it easier to identify this as a new phase. And once I identified that, I started to see these patterns recurring. After the Asian tsunami, there was a very similar push to use the shock of that natural disaster to push through, once again, these same policies: water privatization, electricity privatization, labor market flexibilization, displacing poor people on the coasts with hotel developers. So a sort of social re-engineering of society in the interests of corporations, which I think is what we've been doing under the banner of free trade, but now it's under the banner of post-disaster reconstruction. Well, if we look at the history of the advancement of this really quite radical economic model, of privatizing key state assets, deep cuts to these key social spending areas that people tend to protect, like healthcare and education, or these reforms to labor laws that take away protections, take away pensions, take away the safety net. What we know is that when politicians try to do this during normal circumstances, people tend to organize and resist, because they like their healthcare systems and they actually like having labor protections. So the use of crisis for political ends has been a part of the advancement of this ideology in many lesser ways. In my country, in Canada, we have a public healthcare system. We have a pretty strong social safety net. This is really how we distinguish ourselves from the United States. We lost a lot of these protections in the mid-90s, not because Canadians wanted to. In fact, they had just elected a Liberal government that ran on the platform slogan, jobs, jobs, jobs. But we ended up getting an austerity budget with deep cuts to a lot of these social protections because there was a debt crisis. That's another kind of a shock, and it was really hyped in the media. If we think back to, it's true in the United States as well, this endless rhetoric that, our countries are going to go bankrupt unless we do deep welfare reform or reform of unemployment insurance. So what I do in the shock doctrine is I take another look at the 35 years of history in which this economic model has really swept the globe, from former Eastern Bloc countries, China, Latin America, Africa, and North America. And I look at how various different kinds of crises have facilitated the advancement of this ideology, have prepared the ground. What I'm arguing in the book is that the shocks are getting bigger, that a debt crisis no longer does the trick, or a hyperinflation crisis isn't enough to disorient a whole society and allow them to, or convince them to accept their bitter medicine, that there needs to be something more disorienting. And so what we're seeing now is that bigger shocks are being harnessed. But I do believe that crisis is required to rationalize policies that would be rejected under normal circumstances. It's not a secret that people do protect those policies that make their lives easier. Well, my argument is not that no one benefits. My argument is that the legacy of this economic system is tremendous inequality. It's an opening up of a gap, a gaping gap between the haves and the have-nots. And that's certainly the case in China. That's certainly the case in India. And in both countries, you have governments that have identified inequality as their greatest political challenges to what the Chinese call social stability, because when you have such a dramatic gap between a peasant still living on $1 a day and the super rich who are part of the kind of Davos stratosphere, it creates a tremendous level of resentment and instability within the country. So in China, they're seeing unprecedented levels of protest for this era. They had 87,000 protests a year for the past, starting in 2005, and the number of protests have been going up and up, which has required more and more surveillance, more and more repression, particularly in the run-up to the Beijing Olympics, a lot of concern about this instability. So I think the difficulty really about this economic model or free trade is generalizing the idea that you can just talk about, is it good for China or is it good for India? It's good for a lot of people in India. It's good for a lot of people in China. It's brutal for a lot of people in both of those countries because part of these policies require displacement in the name of mega projects, in the name of building a new export processing zone. So a huge part of this economic model requires displacing millions of people from where they live. So then they become migrants. Where do they go? Well, they go to the cities first, and they move to the slums. And so, the flip side of this economic model of the sort of dazzling version of the world is flat is the explosion of slum dwellers, with the projections that 1 in 3 people in the world will be living in slums within the next decade. So this is you really can't make these generalizations, and that's what we know from having lived with these economic policies now for some 3 decades. I think in the early stages of this economic transformation, it was possible to just use the language of GDP and growth is going to trickle down, and all the promises that were a part of the first phase of this expansion. But now you have all these parts of the world that have actually tried it, right? And the legacy in Latin America is this legacy of following the rules. Countries like Argentina, which were held up as the model students in the 90s, the model students of the International Monetary Fund, and then so much inequality, so much capital flight that 60% of the population fell into poverty. So that's why the model's in crisis. The model's in crisis because people have a track record and they can measure the rhetoric against the reality. I think that mixed economies work better than a fundamentalist market system. I'm not a utopian, and I don't believe it's perfect, and there's still going to be violence, there's still going to be repression, there's still going to be poor people, but by acceptable sort of UN measures of standard of living, what we see is countries that have a mixed economy, i.e. have markets, people are able to go shopping. So I'm not talking about a totalitarian communist state, but also have social protections that identify areas that are too important to leave to the market, whether it's education, healthcare, the minimal standards that everybody of life that everybody must have. That countries that really commit themselves to that vision of a mixed economy. The Scandinavian countries are the obvious example. Canada, before this restructuring that I'm referring to in the 90s, was another, but it certainly, in comparison to the United States and Britain, it continues to be. Germany as well, before their transformation. I mean, by UN rankings, these are the best countries in the world to live in. And the countries that are trying to resist neoliberalism, this economic model, are actually, even if they're being vilified as tyrannical, communists, and all the ways in which Hugo Chavez is being vilified right now in the United States. If you actually look at what the economic program is, it's pretty Keynesian, and it's really just a recovering of some of these basic principles that the state can have a role in the redistribution of wealth. And these ideas are treated as very radical when they're coming from poorer countries that have traditionally played an economic role of just straight extraction, right? They've just supplied, whether raw resources, labor, and that's a very profitable relationship for North American and European multinationals. So when those countries challenge that and say, actually, we'd like an economic system more like yours, right? Then there's tremendous pushback. But historically, if we follow the U.S. military coups, the CIA-backed coups, starting with Mossadegh in Iran, Arbenz in Guatemala, you have this pattern of presenting developing world leaders as much more radical than they actually are. Mossadegh in Iran, Arbenz in Guatemala, these were the first 2 CIA coups in 1953 and 1954. They were economic nationalists who were trying to build mixed economies. And their attempts to build those mixed economies stepped on the toes of some powerful multinationals. In the case of Mossadegh, it was BP. And in the case of Arbenz, it was the United Fruit Company. And that is actually what led to the blowback.